The keys felt heavier than they should have in my palm as I stood before 47 Maple Street in Park Slope, staring at the brownstone that had haunted my dreams for 15 years. At 37, I was successful by most measures. A divorce attorney with my own practice in Manhattan, a co-op on the Upper West Side, a life I'd built carefully away from the shadows of my childhood. But standing here on this crisp October morning in 2023, I felt like that 22-year-old girl again, trembling with the weight of knowledge that had shattered my world. My mother, Catherine Morrison, had died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack, the doctors said. Sudden, peaceful. I hadn't spoken to her in over a decade, hadn't even known she was sick until my estranged aunt called to tell me about the funeral I'd already missed. The guilt of that absence sat in my chest like a stone, competing with the anger that had kept us apart for so long. "You sure you want to go in alone, Liv?" asked my best friend Marcus, who'd driven me here from Manhattan despite my protests that I could handle this myself. Marcus Chen had been my anchor through law school, my business partner, and the closest thing to family I'd allowed myself since walking away from my mother 15 years ago. "I need to do this by myself," I said, though my voice sounded less certain than I'd intended. She left me the house, which means she wanted me to deal with whatever's inside. The lawyer's words echoed in my memory. "Your mother left very specific instructions. She said you'd understand what to do with the contents of the basement when you were ready." The basement, the place I'd sworn never to enter again. The front door opened with surprising ease, as if the house had been waiting for my return. The smell hit me immediately. Lavender and old wood, the scent of my childhood that I'd tried so hard to forget. The interior was exactly as I remembered. Hardwood floors worn smooth by generations of feet, floral wallpaper that had been old-fashioned even when I was a child, photographs covering every available surface. I walked slowly through the living room, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The photographs told the story of a life I'd once been part of. Me as a gap-toothed 7-year-old on my first day of school, my parents dancing at their wedding, family vacations to the Jersey Shore. But I knew these images were lies, carefully constructed props, in an elaborate performance that had been my mother's life. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Peterson case depositions moved to tomorrow. Take all the time you need. Jennifer." Time. 15 years hadn't been enough to process what I'd discovered in this house. How much more time would I need? The kitchen was spotless, as if my mother had been preparing for my return. On the counter was an envelope with my name written in her careful script. "Olivia, read this first." Inside was a single sheet of paper. "My dearest Olivia, if you're reading this, then you found the courage to come home. I know you hate me. I know you have every right to hate me. But I also know that somewhere in your heart you remember the mother who braided your hair, who sang you to sleep, who taught you that even in our darkest moments we can choose redemption. The choice of what to do with what you find is yours now. I've carried this burden for 40 years. I'm ready to let you carry it forward or bury it forever. I love you more than you'll ever know, even if my actions never proved it. Always your mother, Catherine." My hands were shaking as I folded the letter. Part of me wanted to walk out right then, to sell the house site unseen and continue living the life I'd built in willful ignorance of my family's history. But I'd come too far to turn back now. The basement door was painted white now, but I could still see the scratches I'd made as a child, trying to open a door that was always kept locked. "Storage," my mother had always said when I asked what was down there. "Just old family things that aren't important anymore." The key was hanging on a small hook beside the door, exactly where it had been 15 years ago when I'd found it after my father's funeral, when grief and curiosity had driven me to finally discover what my mother had been hiding in the depths of our family home. I turned the key and heard the familiar click of the deadbolt. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into darkness, my phone's flashlight creating a weak beam that barely penetrated the shadows below. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, extending back into what must have been the neighboring property's foundation. But that wasn't what had shocked me 15 years ago. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and maps, all meticulously organized and dated. Headlines screamed from the walls: "Serial killer strikes again in Queens. Police baffled by string of murders. Families demand justice for victims." In the center of the room sat a large wooden desk, its surface covered with manila folders, each one labeled with a date and a name. Names I recognized from the newspaper clippings. Names of people who had been murdered between 1978 and 1983. And beside the desk, exactly where I'd left it 15 years ago, was the photograph that had changed everything. My father, Thomas Morrison, standing beside a police cruiser, wearing a detective's badge, shaking hands with the mayor at what the newspaper caption identified as a commendation ceremony for outstanding police work. The date on the photograph was October 15, 1983. The same date as the last newspaper clipping on the wall, the one announcing that the serial killer known as the Brooklyn Strangler had been caught and killed in a shootout with police. My father, the man I'd idolized my entire childhood, had been the cop who killed the Brooklyn Strangler. That should have made him a hero. Except for the manila folder I'd found that day, 15 years ago, the one labeled Thomas Morrison, Personal Files, filled with evidence that my father hadn't killed the Brooklyn Strangler in a heroic confrontation. He had been the Brooklyn Strangler, and my mother had known. The folder was still there, exactly where I'd left it, as if the basement had been frozen in time since my last visit. Inside were photographs, police reports with altered signatures, witness statements that had been buried, and most damning of all, my mother's own handwritten notes documenting the murders, the cover-up, and her decision to stay silent to protect her family's reputation and her daughter's future. 15 years ago, I'd confronted her with the evidence, screaming accusations through tears of rage and betrayal. She'd tried to explain, to contextualize, to help me understand the impossible situation she'd found herself in as a young mother married to a monster. But I hadn't wanted to understand. I'd wanted to punish her for the lies, for the years of living in a house where family photographs hid the truth of what my father had been, for the realization that every happy memory from my childhood had been built on a foundation of murdered innocence. So I'd walked away, changed my name from Morrison to Green, moved to Manhattan, and spent 15 years trying to forget that Catherine Morrison was my mother and Thomas Morrison was my father. Now, standing in the basement again, I realized that my mother had been carrying this secret alone for 20 years after my departure. The weight of it must have been crushing. My phone rang, startling me in the silence. It was Marcus. "How are you holding up in there?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "I found what I was looking for," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. "Marcus, what if everything you believed about your parents turned out to be a lie? What if the person who raised you had done something unforgivable?" There was a long pause before he answered. I guess I'd try to remember that people are more complex than their worst actions, and that carrying anger for 15 years probably hurts you more than them. After ending the call, I sat in the basement surrounded by the evidence of my family's darkest secrets, and for the first time in 15 years, I tried to imagine what it must have been like for my mother in 1983, discovering that her husband was a killer and having to choose between justice and protecting her child. The choice she made had been wrong, but as I sat there in the silence of that basement, I began to understand that it hadn't been simple. I spent 3 hours in that basement, methodically going through every document, photograph, and newspaper clipping with the analytical skills I'd developed as a lawyer. What emerged was a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of good versus evil that had shaped my understanding for 15 years. My mother hadn't just known about my father's crimes, she had been the one to figure them out. Her handwritten journals, which I'd been too angry to read carefully 15 years ago, told a story that began in early 1983. She'd started noticing inconsistencies in my father's behavior, unexplained absences that didn't match his patrol schedules, clothes that smelled strange when he came home from work, and most disturbingly, his intimate knowledge of crime scene details that hadn't been released to the public. March 15, 1983. Thomas knew about the rope marks before they were mentioned in the briefing. When I asked him how, he said he'd heard it from another detective, but his eyes looked empty, like when he gets angry, but tries to hide it. April 2nd, 1983, found muddy clothes in the trunk of his car. When I asked about them, he got defensive, said he'd had to check a crime scene after his shift, but there was no crime scene that day. I checked the police reports. April 20th, 1983. Olivia asked why Daddy's hands smell like soap all the time. I noticed it too. He scrubs them raw every night when he comes home, sometimes until they bleed. What is he trying to wash off? The journals revealed a woman slowly awakening to a nightmare she couldn't escape. My mother had been 25 years old, with a 2-year-old daughter and no family support system. Her parents had died in a car accident the year before, and she had no siblings. Thomas Morrison was her entire world, and discovering that he was a monster had left her completely isolated. May 10th, 1983. I followed him tonight. Left Olivia with Mrs. Chen next door and followed his patrol car. He didn't go to any of the areas he was assigned to patrol. He went to Queens, to the neighborhood where the last girl was found. I watched him park and walk around for hours, like he was reliving something. May 25th, 1983. Found photographs hidden in his toolbox in the garage. Pictures of the victims. Pictures that were never released to the press. Some of them are, "I can't write about what I saw. I threw up and haven't been able to eat since. How long has this been going on? How many more are there?" The most devastating entry was dated June 1st, 1983. "I know what I have to do. I have to turn him in. Those families deserve justice. Those women deserve justice. But if I do, Olivia will grow up as the daughter of the Brooklyn Strangler. She'll be marked for life, the child of a monster. People will look at her and wonder if evil is hereditary. They'll whisper and point and judge her for something she had nothing to do with. But if I don't turn him in, more people will die. I've been praying for guidance, but God seems silent on this matter. Maybe because there is no right answer." What followed was 3 months of internal torment as my mother wrestled with an impossible choice. She documented every piece of evidence she found, copied police files that my father brought home, and even took photographs of the hidden crime scene photos. She was building a case, but she couldn't bring herself to file it. August 15th, 1983. Another girl was found dead in Brooklyn. I know it was him. I know, and I did nothing to stop it. Her name was Maria Santos. She was 19 years old, wanted to be a teacher. Her blood is on my hands because I chose my daughter over justice. But I would make the same choice again. God help me. I would make the same choice. The resolution came in October 1983, but not in the way my mother had planned. According to her journal and the police reports I found, my father had begun to suspect that she knew about his activities. He'd grown paranoid, violent, and unpredictable. October 10th, 1983. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows that I know. Last night he asked me what I'd been doing in the garage, why I'd moved his tools. When I said I hadn't touched anything, he grabbed my wrist so hard I thought he'd break it. Then he smiled that empty smile and said, "Good, because a man's business should stay private. Don't you think, Catherine?" I'm terrified, not just for myself, but for Olivia. What if he sees her as a liability too? The final entry was dated October 14th, 1983. It's over. Thomas is dead, and I'm the only one who knows the truth about what he really was. Last night, he came home covered in blood, not hiding it anymore, not pretending. He looked me in the eye and said, "I took care of our problem, Catherine. No one will ever question this family again." I thought he meant me. I thought he'd killed someone to keep me quiet. But then I realized he was talking about Mrs. Chen. Sweet Mrs. Chen, who babysat Olivia, who must have seen something or suspected something. I couldn't let him destroy more innocent lives. When he went to shower, I called the police and told them the Brooklyn Strangler was at my house, that I could see him through the window, that he was armed and dangerous. The officers who responded didn't know it was Thomas's house. They shot first and asked questions later, exactly as I knew they would. The other detectives who arrived on scene found the evidence I'd planted in his car: rope, photographs, personal items from the victims. They declared him the Brooklyn Strangler, killed in the line of duty while trying to claim his final victim, his own wife. The case is closed. The city has its justice. The families have their answers. And I have to live with the knowledge that I murdered my husband and let him be buried as a hero so my daughter could grow up without his shame. I sat back in the basement chair, the journal trembling in my hands. My mother hadn't just covered up my father's crimes. She had orchestrated his death and manufactured the evidence that made him a posthumous hero while secretly documenting his guilt. For 40 years, she had carried the weight of being both a killer's widow and a killer herself. She had sacrificed justice for the victims' families to protect her daughter's future, and then sacrificed any possibility of her own peace to ensure the secret died with her. The basement suddenly felt suffocating. I climbed the stairs on shaking legs and found myself back in the kitchen, staring at my mother's final letter with new understanding. Everything I did, the good and the terrible, was to protect the people I loved. She hadn't just been protecting me from the truth about my father. She'd been protecting me from the truth about herself. My phone buzzed with a text from my law partner. "Emergency at the office. Can you come in tonight?" I stared at the message, thinking about my life in Manhattan. The corporate clients, the high-stakes divorces, the carefully constructed professional reputation I'd built over 15 years. Everything I'd achieved had been possible because Catherine Morrison had made sure that Olivia Morrison could disappear and Olivia Green could be born without the stain of her father's crimes. But what did I owe to the families who'd never gotten real justice? What did I owe to my mother's memory? And what did I owe to the truth? I walked back to the basement and looked at the walls covered with evidence one more time. Then I began carefully packing everything into boxes, just as my mother's letter had suggested I would. The choice of what to do with 40 years of secrets was mine now. But first, I needed to understand who Catherine Morrison really was, beyond the journals and the evidence and the impossible choice she'd made in 1983. I needed to forgive her, or at least try to understand if forgiveness was possible. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and began the process of excavating my mother's life beyond the basement secrets. I started with Mrs. Chen, my childhood babysitter, who still lived 2 houses down from the family brownstone despite being well into her 80s. "Olivia?" Mrs. Chen's face lit up when she answered her door, though I could see the confusion in her eyes. "My goodness, you look just like your mother did at your age, but I thought you lived in Manhattan now." "I do, Mrs. Chen. I'm here because my mother passed away recently. I'm trying to understand some things about our family." Her expression immediately softened with sympathy. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Catherine was such a good woman, such a good mother to you, even when—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Even when what?" I prompted gently. Mrs. Chen invited me in for tea, settling into the same floral armchair where she'd sat when I was a child, sneaking me extra cookies while my parents thought I was napping. "Your mother came to see me about 6 months ago," she said, pouring tea with slightly shaky hands. She seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She said she wanted to apologize for all the years of distance between your families. Distance? After your father died, Catherine became very withdrawn. She stopped accepting help, stopped letting me babysit you as much. I always thought it was just grief, you know? But looking back, Mrs. Chen paused, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "I think she was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I don't know exactly, but sometimes I would see her watching you play in the backyard, and her expression was so protective. Not normal mother protectiveness, but like she was guarding against some specific threat." Mrs. Chen reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small envelope. "She asked me to give this to you if you ever came back to the neighborhood, asking questions about her." Inside was another note in my mother's handwriting, shorter this time. "Olivia, if you're reading this, it means you're trying to understand who I was beyond the secret in our basement. Ask Mrs. Patterson about the scholarship fund. Ask Father McKenna about the soup kitchen volunteers. Ask Dr. Williams about the grief counseling group. I spent 40 years trying to balance the scales of justice in the only ways I could. Love, Mom." Over the next several days, I followed the trail my mother had left me. Each conversation revealed another facet of Catherine Morrison that I'd never known existed. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s, had been the principal at the elementary school I'd attended. She welcomed me into her retirement apartment in Bay Ridge with obvious pleasure. "Your mother was extraordinary," she said without preamble. Starting in 1984, she began making anonymous donations to fund college scholarships for children from low-income families. But it wasn't just the money. She would personally mentor these kids, help them with applications, even pay for SAT prep courses. "Anonymous donations?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. She insisted that no one ever know the money came from her, said she didn't want recognition, just wanted to help kids who might not otherwise have opportunities. Over the years, she funded full scholarships for at least 30 students. Mrs. Patterson showed me photographs from various graduation ceremonies, images of young people in caps and gowns, beaming with pride, unaware that the woman standing quietly in the back of the auditorium had made their education possible. She said education was the best way to break cycles of poverty and violence, Mrs. Patterson continued. That giving young people hope and opportunity was the most important work anyone could do. Father McKenna at St. Francis Church had a similar story. Catherine volunteered at our soup kitchen every Saturday for over 20 years, he told me, as we sat in the empty sanctuary. Rain or shine, she was here serving meals, washing dishes, organizing food drives. She never missed a week until she got sick. She was sick? I asked, guilt twisting in my stomach at the realization that I hadn't known. Heart problems, he said gently. Started about 2 years ago. But even when she could barely walk up the church steps, she insisted on coming in to help prepare meals. Said serving others was how she stayed connected to God's grace. Did she ever talk about her family? About me? Father McKenna's expression grew sad. Every week, she would ask me to pray for her daughter, who was doing important work in the world, but who carried too much anger in her heart. She never blamed you for staying away, Olivia. She just hoped that someday you'd find peace. Dr. Williams, a grief counselor who had worked with bereaved families for decades, told me about my mother's volunteer work with people who had lost loved ones to violent crimes. Catherine had a gift for helping people process anger and loss, she explained, as we sat in her office overlooking Prospect Park. She understood something about grief that you can't learn from textbooks, the way it changes you, the way it can either destroy you or transform you into someone who can help others heal. How long did she volunteer with your group? Nearly 20 years. She facilitated support groups, provided one-on-one counseling, even helped organize memorial services for families who couldn't afford them. She specialized in helping people who were struggling with complicated grief, situations where they felt anger toward the person they'd lost, or guilt about their own survival. Dr. Williams paused, studying my face carefully. She talked about you often. Said she understood why you needed to stay away, but hoped that someday you'd understand that people can carry terrible secrets and still do good in the world. As I walked back to my mother's house that evening, I began to see the pattern in what she'd spent 40 years doing. The scholarship fund, the soup kitchen, the grief counseling. All of it was focused on helping people who were vulnerable, people who might otherwise be forgotten or overlooked. People like the victims, her silence had denied justice. That night, I found myself back in the basement, but this time I wasn't looking at the evidence of my father's crimes or my mother's complicity. Instead, I was looking at additional boxes I'd initially overlooked. Files containing thank you letters from scholarship recipients, photographs from soup kitchen Christmas dinners, program materials from grief support groups. One letter, written in careful cursive by a teenage girl named Maria Santos, the same name as one of my father's victims, brought tears to my eyes. Dear Mrs. Morrison, I know I'm not supposed to know who paid for my scholarship, but Mrs. Patterson accidentally left your name on one of the forms. I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to go to college. My grandmother always said that angels walk among us, and I think you must be one of them. Because of your gift, I'm going to become a teacher and help other kids like me find their way. I don't know why you chose to help me, but I promise I'll pay it forward someday. With love and gratitude, Maria Santos. I sat in that basement until dawn, surrounded by evidence of 2 different legacies: the horrific crimes my mother had helped cover up, and the 40 years of quiet service she'd devoted to healing the kinds of wounds those crimes had created. Neither legacy erased the other. But for the first time in 15 years, I began to understand that human beings are capable of containing contradictions, of being both complicit in terrible things and devoted to beautiful ones. My mother had made an unforgivable choice in 1983, but she had spent the rest of her life trying to earn forgiveness through service to others, even knowing that the people she'd helped most would never know her real name or understand the depth of her need for redemption. As the sun rose over Brooklyn, casting golden light through the basement windows, I finally understood what my mother had been trying to tell me in her letters. The choice of how to remember her and how to carry her legacy forward was mine now. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma therapist recommended by Dr. Williams, trying to articulate the impossible complexity of grieving someone you'd spent 15 years hating. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did, Dr. Martinez explained gently. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their choices as your own weight. But how do you forgive someone who helped cover up serial murders? How do you honor a mother who spent 40 years in service to others while maintaining a lie that denied justice to grieving families? The answer began to emerge when I started reaching out to the families of my father's victims. Using my legal resources, I tracked down surviving relatives, children who were now adults, siblings who had spent decades wondering why their loved one had died. I met Maria Santos's sister, Carmen, at a coffee shop in Queens. She was in her 60s now, with gray hair and kind eyes that reminded me painfully of the young woman in my father's hidden photographs. "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to tell me what really happened to my sister," Carmen said when I explained why I'd contacted her. I told her everything: the basement evidence, my mother's journals, the real story of how the Brooklyn Strangler case had been closed. Carmen listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face. "Your mother," she said finally. "She was the one who funded the scholarship in Maria's name, wasn't she?" I nodded, unable to speak. "All these years, I thought it was some anonymous donor who just wanted to honor Maria's memory. I never imagined." She paused, struggling with her own complex emotions. She couldn't give us justice, but she tried to give us hope. Over the following months, I met with 8 other families, sharing the truth my mother had hidden and documenting their responses. Some reacted with anger, demanding to know why I wasn't taking the evidence to police. Others, like Carmen, seemed to find a strange comfort in finally understanding the full story. One conversation changed everything. I was speaking with Robert Chen, the son of my father's final victim. The Mrs. Chen my mother had been convinced my father killed to silence her. "The thing is," Robert told me, "my mother wasn't killed by the Brooklyn Strangler. She died of cancer in 1987. I think your mother might have been confused about what happened that night." The revelation sent me back to my mother's journals with new eyes. Rereading her final entries, I realized that her decision to orchestrate my father's death hadn't been triggered by another murder. It had been triggered by his threat against Mrs. Chen, a threat that he might never have acted upon. My mother had killed her husband based on fear of what he might do, not evidence of what he had done. The distinction mattered. It didn't change the fact that she'd orchestrated a man's death and covered up his crimes, but it revealed another layer of the impossible situation she'd found herself in at age 25. 6 months after my mother's death, I made my decision about what to do with the evidence in our basement. I couldn't turn it over to police. The statute of limitations had passed, and exposing my father's crimes now would only re-traumatize families who had found ways to move forward. But I also couldn't destroy it, because those families deserved to know their loved ones hadn't been forgotten. Instead, I created the Morrison Foundation, funded by the sale of the Brooklyn house and dedicated to providing support services for families of violent crime victims. The foundation's work included grief counseling, financial assistance, and advocacy for victims' rights, all the things my mother had been doing quietly for decades. I met with Carmen Santos one final time to tell her about the foundation. She listened as I explained how the money would be used to help other families navigate the aftermath of violent loss. "Your mother," Carmen said finally, "she wasn't a hero. What she did was wrong, and I'll always wish we'd gotten real justice for Maria. But she spent 40 years trying to heal the kind of wounds she'd helped create. That has to count for something." On the first anniversary of my mother's death, I stood in the cemetery where she was buried, finally ready to have the conversation we'd never been able to have in life. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said aloud, feeling foolish but somehow lighter for saying it. "What you did was unforgivable, but I understand now that you spent your whole life trying to earn forgiveness anyway." I thought about the scholarship recipients who would graduate because of money earned through 40 years of her secret guilt. I thought about the soup kitchen volunteers she'd trained, the grieving families she'd counseled, the cycles of violence she'd tried to break through education and service. "I can't forgive the choice you made in 1983, I continued, tears streaming down my face, "but I can forgive you for being human enough to spend the rest of your life trying to make amends." As I walked away from her grave, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a moment or a decision. It was an ongoing process of choosing to remember someone's full story, not just their worst chapter. 2 years later, I moved my law practice to Brooklyn, specializing in representing families of crime victims. My apartment is 6 blocks from the house where I grew up, close enough that I can walk past it regularly without the crushing weight of secrets. The basement has been converted into the foundation's offices, Where evidence of my father's crimes once covered the walls, we now have photographs of families we've helped, students we've supported, and communities we've served. I keep my mother's journals in my desk drawer, not as evidence of guilt or innocence, but as a reminder that people are capable of carrying contradictions, of being both complicit in terrible things and devoted to healing the wounds those things create. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't mean excusing the unforgivable. It means acknowledging that human beings are complex enough to contain both darkness and light, and choosing to honor someone's attempts at redemption even when they can never fully atone for their failures. I still don't know if what my mother did was right or wrong, but I know that she spent 40 years trying to balance scales that could never truly be balanced, and that her granddaughter, the child I hope to have someday, will grow up in a world slightly safer because Catherine Morrison chose service over silence, even when she couldn't choose justice over protection. The house on Maple Street stands empty now, but its basement holds something different than secrets. It holds hope, and the possibility that even our worst family legacies can be transformed into something that heals rather than hurts. That's not forgiveness, exactly, but it's enough to build a life on.